I'm Adrienne Harper, 44 years old, and I spent 22 years in the United States Navy defusing the kind of devices most people only see in their nightmares. For 2 decades, I gave everything I had to the work, to my team, and to a country that asked me to kneel in the dark and make the world a little safer, one impossible night at a time. But the morning I arrived to take over my new command, dressed down in a plain gray shirt with nobody knowing my face, a man who had never once been told no knocked my coffee across a table and laughed in front of a room full of recruits. What happened the moment that room found out who I was changed how I understood the difference between being feared and being respected. Have you ever been dismissed, talked down to, or underestimated by someone who never bothered to learn who you really were? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You are not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you are tuning in from. And if you have ever had to hold your head high after someone tried to make you feel small, hit that like button and subscribe. The first time my father let me hold a torque wrench, I was 6 years old, standing on an upturned milk crate in a garage that always smelled of diesel and cold coffee. He was rebuilding a transmission for a neighbor, and I handed him sockets in the order he called them, learning the language of bolts and bearings before I learned cursive. I thought, back then, that being useful was the same thing as being loved, and it took me a long time, and a few wars, to understand the difference. We lived in a flat, sun-bleached town in inland California, the kind of place where the freeway was the loudest thing for miles. My father, Glenn Harper, was a diesel mechanic with hands like cracked leather and a way of measuring people by whether they could be counted on to show up. My older brother, Dean, was 4 years ahead of me, and good at the things my father admired out loud. I was good at the things my father never thought to praise. I could find the rattle in an engine he had given up on. I could sit still for 3 hours while he worked and hand him the right tool without being asked. And every time I did, he would say thank you to the air and then go talk about Dean. By the time I was 13, in the summer of 1995, I had stopped waiting for him to notice and started simply being good for my own sake. I rebuilt a carburetor on the workbench that year, alone, over a weekend, and when I showed him it ran clean, he looked at it for a moment and said, "Huh, go see if your brother needs help with the lawn." I learned to read a torque wrench before I learned to stop hoping my father would turn around. Both took practice. There was one afternoon I have never forgotten, the kind of small moment that turns out to be load-bearing for an entire life. I was 11, and a man from down the street brought in a truck that 2 other shops had given up on, an intermittent stall nobody could chase down. My father spent a whole Saturday on it and got nowhere, and he was the kind of frustrated that made the garage go quiet. I had been listening to that engine all day from the corner where I did my homework, and I had heard something he had not, a hitch in the idle that came and went with the heat. I told him quietly that I thought it was a cracked sensor that only failed once it warmed up. He looked at me like I had spoken in a language he did not know I had. He did not test the theory in front of me, but that night, after I was supposed to be asleep, I heard him out there with a heat gun and a meter, and the next morning the truck ran clean, and he never said a word about it. I used to think that silence was the worst thing he could have given me, and it took me years to understand it was also a gift. He taught me, without ever meaning to, that being right does not require an audience, and that the work itself will tell you the truth, even when the people will not. I carried that into rooms full of explosives. It kept me alive. My mother was the soft place in that house, the one who told me the rest of the world would see what my father couldn't. She died when I was in college, and I have spent 20 years wishing she had lived long enough to be in the room for what came later. She believed in me with a quiet that never needed an audience. I think I learned my whole leadership style from a woman who never gave an order in her life. When I graduated high school in the spring of 2000, I stood in our kitchen and told my family I had been accepted to college, and that afterward I intended to commission into the United States Navy. The silence had a texture to it. My father set down his fork. He told me the military was no place for his daughter, that it would chew me up, that I should find something sensible and stay close. Dean laughed in the way he had perfected, the one that landed soft so he could deny it later. "You," he said, "you cried when you skinned your knee on the driveway. You won't last a month." I did not argue. Arguing with Dean was like arguing with the television. I just decided, standing there with my diploma still rolled in my hand, that I would let the years do the talking. I would not spend my life trying to convince people who had already finished deciding. I would go somewhere the work answered for me, and I would let the silence at that kitchen table be the last word my family got for a while. The people who underestimate you collect in your memory like sediment, and by the end of what I am about to tell you, I had a lifetime of them, and I had learned something about who they really are. But that comes later. First, you have to understand that I did not join the Navy to prove anyone wrong. I joined because somewhere under all that diesel and dismissal, I had built an engine of my own, and it would only ever run pointed forward. College taught me discipline, but officer candidate school taught me what I was actually made of. In the Navy's explosive ordnance disposal pipeline, taught me that the dismissal I grew up with simply changes uniforms. It does not disappear. It puts on coveralls and waits for you in a new place. I commissioned as an ensign in 2004, 22 years old, all certainty and no scars. I had read about EOD, the small, strange community that handles bombs nobody else will touch. And something about it called to me the way the rattle in a dying engine had called to me as a kid. It was the hardest road in the Navy, and the road with the fewest people who looked like me. When I told a detailer I wanted it, he raised an eyebrow and said most candidates quit. I told him I was counting on most candidates quitting. I just did not intend to be one of them. The man who changed my life was a weathered Master Chief named Walt Sumner, who ran a mentorship session for officer candidates considering the community. He had been blown up twice and still walked like he owned the ground. He did not coddle me. He did not tell me I could do it, the way people tell you things to be kind. He looked at me with eyes that had seen the worst day of a lot of lives and said something I have repeated to myself 1,000 times since. "I'm not going to tell you that you can do this," he said. "I'm going to tell you it'll try to break you, and then I'm going to find out what you're made of." It was the first time an authority figure had bothered to challenge me instead of dismissing me, and I would have followed that man through a wall. He saw me clearly, which is a rarer gift than people understand. Most of the world looks at you and sees a category. Walt Sumner looked at me and saw a question worth answering. The pipeline did try to break me. I was the only woman in my class through dive phase and demolition phase, and one instructor made a show of betting I would ring the bell before the others. I heard about the bet the way you always hear about those things, sideways, in a hallway. I did not finish first. I finished middle of the pack, on grid alone, because nobody in that world hands you belonging. You earn it one impossible day at a time, and then you wake up and earn it again. The instructor who bet against me shook my hand at graduation. He did not apologize. In that world, the handshake is the apology. What I learned in that pipeline was not how to be the strongest person in the room, because I never was. I learned how to be the last one standing, which is a different and more useful skill. The strongest people quit all the time. They are used to things coming easily, and the first time the world refuses to bend, some of them simply walk away from it, baffled and offended. The ones who finish are the ones who have already made peace with suffering, who treat misery as information rather than insult. I had a head start on that because I had spent 18 years being quietly told I was not quite enough, and I had learned to keep moving anyway. The dismissal I grew up with, the thing I thought was my wound, turned out to be the exact muscle the work required. That is the strange arithmetic of it. The people who underestimate you, if you let them, can accidentally forge the very thing that proves them wrong. My first operational detachment shipped overseas in 2006, when I was a lieutenant junior grade with more confidence than judgment. On my first real call, a young technician's hands were shaking so badly he could not seat a tool. I knelt next to him and talked him through the procedure in the same voice my mother used to use. Low and even, like we had all the time in the world even though we did not. We rendered the device safe. My chief watched the whole thing, and afterward he told me I led by calm, not by volume, and that it would either be my greatest strength or get me killed. It turned out to be the first one. In 2008, I made lieutenant and took my own team. That was the year I met Petty Officer Eli Sandoval, the best technician I ever served with. A man who could disarm anything and make you laugh while he did it. We were at a forward operating base chow hall when a cocky young SEAL element started in on us. The bomb babysitters, the ones who showed up after the real work was done. Eli just smiled into his tray. 2 days later, my team cleared a route, that kept that same element from driving into a daisy chain of buried charges, and not one of them laughed at us again. They'll laugh at us until the day they need us, Eli told me that night. Then they never laugh again. Respect in this business is always paid late, but it's always paid in full. I held on to that. It got me through a lot of chow halls full of men who had already decided who I was. What I did not know, sitting there in 2008, was that I would spend the rest of my career proving Eli right, and that one day, 18 years later, in a mess hall on the other side of the world, a man would knock my coffee across a table and prove him right one final, perfect time. I called home that year and tried to explain what I did. My father changed the subject to a truck he was fixing. Dean asked when I was going to get a real life. I had earned the trust of hardened men on 3 continents, and I still could not earn a full sentence of curiosity from the people who raised me. I hung up, and I sat in the quiet, and I let it harden into fuel the way I always did. 22 years after I commissioned, in the spring of 2026, I was a Navy captain selected to take command of a Special Operations Preparatory Training Command, the place where the hardest candidates in the fleet get sorted into the ones who will make it and the ones who will not. I had spent 2 decades earning the right to that office. And the first thing I did with it was walk in the door like I owned nothing at all. I flew in a day early. I told no one my exact arrival time. I checked in at the front gate under my own name, in plain physical training gear, gray shirt and shorts, no insignia, no entourage, and when the young sentry offered to call an escort, I told him not to bother. You learn more about a command in 1 hour when nobody knows you are watching than in a month of staged briefings. I wanted the unvarnished truth of the place before the salutes started rearranging it. So I walked the grounds at dawn like any anonymous middle-aged woman who happened to be on base. And when the mess hall opened for breakfast, I grabbed a tray and got in line. The mess hall was loud and crowded, full of candidates with shaved heads and the hollow-eyed exhaustion of people being deliberately broken down and rebuilt. I got eggs and coffee and found a seat at the end of a long bench near the back against the wall where I could watch the room. Nobody looked at me twice. I was 44 years old in a gray shirt, invisible by design, exactly the way I wanted to be. For about 4 minutes, I just drank my coffee and watched young people learn to suffer well. Then Chief Petty Officer Brett Maddox walked into my life. I did not know his name yet. I only knew the type instantly, the way you know weather. He was built like a door, mid-30s, moving through the room with the swagger of a man who had never been told no inside these walls. The candidates went quiet and small as he passed, the way a field of grass lies down before a storm. He was the most feared instructor on the base, and he wore that fear like a decoration. He saw me sitting at the end of the bench, an unfamiliar face in a spot the cadre treated as theirs, and something in him decided to make an example of me for the entertainment of the room. He did not ask me to move. He slammed the flat of his palm into my shoulder, hard enough to knock me sideways into the table and send my coffee sheeting across the surface and over my hand. Then he laughed. "Wrong table, sweetheart," he said, loud enough for the whole back of the room to hear. "That bench is for real operators." The candidates laughed with him. Not because it was funny, because not laughing in front of Chief Maddox was dangerous, and they had learned that lesson already. I felt the coffee, hot, soaking into my sleeve, and I felt 100 eyes slide toward me to watch how the old woman would crumble. I have knelt over devices built to kill everyone in a city block. I have held the last thought of a man whose hands were steadier than mine had any right to be. A spilled cup of coffee was not going to be the thing that broke me. I did not stand up into his chest. I did not announce who I was. I picked up a napkin, wiped the coffee off the back of my hand with the unhurried calm of someone who has decided exactly nothing he does will land. And I gathered my tray to move to another seat. In front of trainees, the worst thing a leader can do is turn a bully's theater into a brawl. I would deal with Chief Maddox. I would deal with him on my terms and my time, and not 1 second of it would be for the benefit of an audience. I was halfway to standing when the side door of the mess hall opened. Command Master Chief Earl Doyle was the senior enlisted leader of the command, a 51-year-old man with a quarter-century of sea and sand behind his eyes, and he had been part of the change of command brief that very week. He saw my face from across the room, and I watched it land on him like a physical thing. His spine went rigid. His tray hit the nearest surface, and his voice, when it came, was the kind of voice that has commanded flight decks in the dark. "Attention on deck!" he bellowed. Captain Harper, your new commanding officer. I will remember the sound of that mess hall for the rest of my life. It was the sound of 100 young people realizing all at once whose coffee Chief Maddox had just knocked across a table. They had been briefed that very morning on my Navy Cross citation, told it was the standard they were being measured against, shown a face on a slide, and told to remember it. And here that face was, dripping coffee, 6 feet from a man who had just struck it for sport. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Somebody actually choked, then somebody else, a whole row of candidates coughing into their fists as their bodies tried to swallow and gasp at the same time. The laughter died so fast it left a vacuum. Chief Maddox went white. I have seen that exact color drain out of exactly that kind of face before. The moment the device they were sure was inert begins to tick. He came to attention so hard I heard his teeth click. I stood the rest of the way up. I set my tray down. I did not look at Maddox because looking at him would have given the room a fight to watch, and I had already decided to give them something far more useful. I looked at the candidates, the 100 frightened kids who had just learned something about power they would carry their whole lives. And I spoke in the same low, even voice I once used to talk a shaking technician through a render safe. "Carry on," I said. "Eat your food. You've got a long day ahead of you." Then I walked out with Command Master Chief Doyle, leaving a silent mess hall and a chief who could not feel his own hands behind me. And not once, from the moment that palm hit my shoulder to the moment the door closed, had I raised my voice. The CO's office was still mostly bare when Doyle followed me into it, a desk, a flag, a stack of binders nobody had read to me yet. He shut the door and stood there with the particular discomfort of a senior enlisted man who feels personally responsible for something that was never his fault. "Ma'am, I am sorry," he said. "That should never have happened. Say the word, and I'll have Chief Maddox reassigned by Friday. I'll have him off this base." I sat down behind the desk and looked at him for a long moment. Doyle expected me to want blood. Most people in my position would have. There is a version of that morning where I ended a man's career between bites of breakfast and felt righteous about it. And I understand the appeal of that version, but I did not fly in a day early and walk the grounds in a gray shirt to satisfy my own pride. I came to understand the command I was inheriting, and Chief Maddox had just told me more about it in 15 seconds than the binders would in a month. "I don't want him gone by Friday," I said. "I want to understand what we built that let him think that was normal." Doyle blinked, then he sat down across from me, and slowly, something in him eased, because I think he had spent years bracing for a commander who would treat the symptom and never touch the disease. He told me about Maddox. Brett Maddox was a genuinely gifted operator with real combat time, the kind of man who had earned his trident the hard way and had the record to prove it. Somewhere in the years since, the skill had curdled. He had confused being feared with being respected, confused breaking people with building them, and nobody above him had ever cared enough to tell him the difference. He ran the highest washout rate of any instructor on the base, and the command had quietly decided that was a feature, because attrition was the point, and nobody wanted to ask whether he was washing out the wrong people for the wrong reasons. "He's not a monster, ma'am," Doyle said, and I could hear that he meant it. "He's the best stick we've got on some of these evolutions. He's just gotten it into his head that cruelty and standards are the same thing, and nobody's been willing to take that on because taking it on means taking on him. I've met that man 100 times, I said, in 100 chow halls. He's not new. He's just never had a commander who outranked his reputation." That evening I walked the waterfront path along the edge of the base alone, the way I have always thought best, with salt in the air and the light going long and gold over the water. I thought about the difference between hard and cruel, a difference I had spent my whole career living on the right side of. Walt Sumner had been the hardest man I ever trained under, and he had never once made me feel small. He pushed me to the edge of what I could survive because he believed I was worth the trouble of being pushed. Maddox pushed people off the edge because it was easier than teaching them to climb. The two things look identical from a distance. Up close, they are opposites. I thought, too, about how easy the other path would have been. I could have walked back into that mess hall the next morning in my service dress, every ribbon visible, and made Chief Maddox stand in front of the candidates and apologize until his voice shook. The room would have loved it. There is a hunger in people for that kind of spectacle, the public ruin of someone who had it coming. And I will not pretend I did not feel the pull of it myself. but I have watched what spectacle does to a unit. It teaches everyone in the room that power is a weapon you point at, whoever is weakest that day, and it simply hands the weapon to a new person. The candidates would have learned the wrong lesson twice, once from Maddox and once from me. I did not want them afraid of Chief Maddox. I also did not want them afraid of me. I wanted them to walk out of my command, unafraid of everything except their own standards. You cannot teach that with the humiliation. You can only teach it by refusing to perform one when everyone expects you to. Back in my temporary quarters that night, I unpacked the one thing I always unpack first, a framed photo of Eli Sandoval, grinning into a camera at a forward operating base 17 years ago, alive in the way only the dead stay in photographs. I sat on the edge of the bunk and looked at him for a while. I did not let myself go all the way back to the night I lost him, not yet, but the edges of it pressed in. Eli used to say the job was never about being unbreakable. It was about being the person who stays when everyone else has a reason to run. He had stayed. It had cost him everything. And I had spent the years since trying to be worth the staying. That, in the end, was why I fought to lead a training command instead of taking a quieter, more prestigious staff job that would have looked better on paper. Somewhere out there was the next Eli Sandoval, a young person with everything it takes, standing in a pipeline run by men who might break them for sport before the fleet ever got the chance to be saved by them. I could not bring Eli back, but I could make sure the people coming up behind him had instructors worth following. The next morning, I pulled the command's attrition data and read it the way I read everything, slowly, looking for the rattle under the noise. And there it was, a pattern under Maddox's classes, a particular kind of candidate who washed out at a rate that had nothing to do with capability and everything to do with one man's idea of who belonged. I closed the folder. I was not going to fire Brett Maddox. Firing him would have been easy, and it would have changed nothing about the next Brett Maddox. I was going to do something harder and far more permanent. I was going to build a standard so clean it left him nowhere to hide. I called the full instructor cadre into the classroom 3 days later, Chief Maddox among them, and I did not say a single word about the mess hall. Shaming him in front of his peers would have made the morning about me, and it was never going to be about me. Instead, I laid out a new standard for the people who train our hardest candidates, and I framed it as what it was, the difference between the command we were and the command we were going to be. Hard is the standard, I told them. I want it to be the hardest thing any of you have ever done. But hard and cruel are not the same word, and I am going to be very precise about which one we are. Cruel is a man covering for the fact that he forgot how to teach. We are going to be hard. We are not going to be cruel. And from today, we are going to be able to tell the difference on paper. Then I told them how. Every washout decision would be documented with the specific standard the candidate failed to meet. Every hands-on corrective would be justified and logged. We would track not just how many candidates an instructor washed out, but how many he developed. How many marginal performers he turned into operators instead of discarding. I was not lowering the bar. I was making the bar visible, and a visible bar is a bully's worst enemy, because intimidation cannot survive being written down. I watched Maddox while I spoke. He sat very still, and I could see him calculating, because men like him are always calculating. He thought I was softening the pipeline. He thought I was an outsider who did not understand the teams. He was wrong on both counts, but he did not know that yet. I met with him privately that afternoon in my office, with the door closed. I did not bring up the coffee. I had read his service record by then, every page of it, and I led with that. I read your record, Chief, I said. All of it. The man in that record is one of the finest operators this Navy has produced. I mean that. I am not going to pretend the morning in the mess hall didn't happen, but I am also not going to pretend it's the whole of you, because your record says it isn't. He shifted, wary, waiting for the trap. With respect, ma'am, he said, you don't know what it takes to make operators. I let the silence sit for a second. Then I told him the truest thing I know. I know exactly what it takes, I said. I buried the proof. I am not going to end your career over breakfast, Chief. I'm going to give you something worse. I'm going to give you a chance to be the instructor your record says you could be, in front of every candidate who watched you knock my coffee across that table. You can rise to the standard I just set, or you can decide you'd rather not, and remove yourself. But you are not going to keep being feared on my command and calling it excellence. That door is closed." He left without saying much. I had not expected him to. Change does not announce itself. It sulks first. What followed was the part I had braced for. Maddox went to the cadre lounge and tried to rally the old guard, the instructors who had built their identities on the same intimidation, casting me as the politically correct outsider who was here to ruin the teams and hand out participation trophies. Some of them nodded. That is how these things always go. But one of them, a quiet senior instructor named Reuben, who had more combat time than all of them and the least to prove, did not nod. He just looked at his coffee, and Maddox saw it. The first crack in his support did not come from me. It came from the silence of one man who had been waiting a long time for someone to say out loud what he already believed. Then the pressure came from above, the way it always does. A phone call from a 1-star at the parent command, gentle, concerned. The kind of call that is really a question dressed as support. He had heard there was friction at my command. He wanted to know, with all the diplomacy of a man who outranked me, whether I was sure I was picking the right first fight. New commanders are supposed to settle in before they start rearranging the furniture. I told him the truth. I told him the friction was the sound of a problem that had been ignored for years finally being touched. I told him I was not going to spend my command pretending cruelty was a tradition worth protecting, and that if he wanted to relieve me over insisting that instructors document why they break the people we are paying them to build, he was welcome to do it in writing. There was a long pause on the line, and then, to his credit, the 1-star said the words I needed. He said, "Carry on, Captain." And he backed me. I hung up the phone and sat in my still bare office and understood that I had just bet my own reputation on the idea that I was right. I had been doing that my whole life. I was not about to stop now. That night I wrote a single page by hand, the way I write the things that matter, and I kept it in my desk drawer for the rest of my command. It was not a policy. It was a reminder to myself in case the pressure ever made me forget. It said that the measure of this command would not be how many people we broke, but how many we built who would not break when it counted. It said that fear is the cheapest tool in the box and the first one a lazy leader reaches for, and that I had not spent 22 years on my knees in the dark to come home and run a school on the same intimidation. I had spent a career proving wrong. I read that page on the hard mornings. There were several. Changing a culture is not a single brave speech. It is 1,000 small refusals to take the easy, cruel path, repeated until the easy path stops being a temptation and starts being unthinkable. The thing about a visible standard is that it does not argue with anyone. It just waits, patient as gravity, for the truth to surface. It took about 3 weeks for Brett Maddox's world to crack. And when it did, it cracked along a line he had drawn himself. It happened during a high-risk evolution at the dive and obstacle complex, the kind of training that lives close to the edge of real danger and depends entirely on the instructor's judgment about when to push and when to pull back. Maddox had spent days hazing a particular candidate, a quiet kid named Owen Beck, who reminded me, if I am honest, of a younger version of myself. Capable and overlooked, and one cruel sentence away from quitting something he was actually built for. During the evolution, Beck froze, not from weakness, from the specific paralysis that sets in when a young person has been told so many times that they are nothing that their body finally believes it at the worst possible moment. The old command would have called it a washout and moved on. Beck would have been gone by sundown, another name in a column, and Maddox would have shrugged and called it the standard. But the standard was visible now. The new safety documentation required Maddox to justify in writing the call he had made in the moments around that freeze, the decisions that led to it, the supervision he had or had not provided, and he could not do it cleanly, because the honest answer was that his methods had manufactured the very failure he was about to punish. Nobody got hurt, the evolution was contained, the safeties did their job, Beck was pulled and rested, but the gap was exposed in ink where everyone could see it. Cruelty had never been the same thing as competence, and now there was a form that proved it. I want to be precise about what the documentation actually changed, because it would be easy to hear all this as paperwork strangling the warrior spirit. And that is exactly the story Maddox told himself. It changed nothing about how hard the training was. The evolutions were as brutal the week after as the week before. What it changed was the question we asked when a candidate failed. The old question was simply whether they had quit, and a man like Maddox could engineer a quit out of almost anyone if he wanted to. With the right word, at the right exhausted moment. The new question was why they failed and whether the instructor had set the conditions for an honest test or a rigged one. That single shift took the power out of cruelty, because cruelty produces a very specific kind of failure, the kind that has the instructor's fingerprints all over it. You cannot haze someone into quitting and then write down a clean reason they were not good enough. The form will not let you. The truth, once it is required in ink, has a way of crowding out everything else in the room. I ran the after-action review myself, with Doyle beside me and the full cadre in the room, and I did not attack Brett Maddox. I did not have to. I just walked through the facts, and I asked questions, and I let his own peers answer them. For the first time, the room was not afraid to disagree with him. Reuben, the quiet senior instructor, spoke first, and once he did, others followed, and what came out was not a mutiny. It was just the truth, finally unafraid of the man it concerned. The currency of that command had been fear for years. In one AAR, I watched it change to honesty, and once that exchange rate flips, it does not flip back. Maddox sat through it with his jaw set. I have wondered since what that hour was like from inside his skin, watching the thing he had built on terror dissolve into a calm, fair, factual conversation that did not need to raise its voice to take him apart. Late that night, I am told, he sat alone in the cadre lounge. And the one man who had refused to nod, Reuben, came and sat with him, and told him the truth that I, as his commander, could never have delivered with the same weight. He told Maddox that people had followed him out of fear, not respect, and that the difference had just become visible to everyone in the building. He told him fear empties a room the moment a bigger fear walks in, but respect stays. And then he left Maddox alone with that. Doyle came to my office the next morning expecting me to finish the job. I could see it in his posture, the readiness to execute the order he assumed was coming. Relieve Maddox, make the example permanent, close the book. No, I told him. He frowned. Ma'am, the point was never to win against one chief, I said. If I break him now, I've just proven that this command runs on whoever is scariest, and I've made myself the scary one. That's not a fix. That's a new bully with better paperwork. The point was to make this command honest. It's honest now. What he does with that is up to him. I looked at Eli's photo, which I had moved to the corner of my desk. I didn't come here to win against one chief. I came here to make sure the next Eli has instructors worth following. If Maddox wants to become one of those, the door is open. If he doesn't, he'll walk through the other one on his own. Either way, I don't have to push. Doyle was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly, the way a man nods when he has just watched something he did not expect and found it better than what he had braced for. Out in the cadre spaces, Brett Maddox was discovering what it is to be a feared man in a room that is no longer afraid. The silence around him was not respect. It never had been. And for the first time in years, he had to sit with the difference. Brett Maddox came to my office on a gray Tuesday, almost a month after the mess hall, and he did not come with a speech. That is how I knew it was real. The men who arrive with a polished apology are usually apologizing to themselves. Maddox arrived with his cover in his hands, and his eyes somewhere around the middle distance. Like a man walking into water, he is not sure he can swim. Ma'am, he said, I owe you more than an apology. I'm not going to insult you by performing one. He stopped, started again. I've been a chief for a long time. I'm good at exactly one way of making operators, and you've shown me, in writing, that it doesn't actually work as well as I told myself it did. I don't know how to be the instructor you described in that classroom. I'd like to learn how, if you'll let me. He mentioned the mess hall exactly once, plainly, without flinching from it. He said he was ashamed, not ashamed of being caught, which is the cheap kind, ashamed of the man who would knock a stranger's coffee across a table for the amusement of frightened kids before he ever knew or cared who she was. He said the worst part was not that he had done it to a Navy Cross recipient. The worst part was that he would have done it to anyone, and had, many times, to people whose names he never bothered to learn. I did not absolve him. Absolution was not mine to give, and handing it to him would have been its own kind of cruelty, the kind that lets a man off the hook before he has done the work, so I put him to work instead. You'll start, I said, by mentoring the candidate you almost broke. Owen Beck. He's back in the pipeline. You're going to earn his trust back before you ask for mine, and you're going to do it knowing he has every reason to never give it to you. That's the job now, Chief. Not breaking the weak ones, building the ones everybody else gave up on. It was, I think, the hardest thing I could have asked him to do, which is exactly why I asked it. It did not go smoothly, and I would not trust it if it had. The first weeks were awkward and stiff. Maddox did not know how to coach without the scaffolding of fear, and you could see him reaching for the old cruelty, the way a man reaches for a missing tooth with his tongue. But he stayed in it. He learned to correct without humiliating. He learned to stand next to a struggling candidate instead of over him. Owen Beck, wary as a beaten dog at first, slowly began to respond because young people can always tell the difference between a man performing patience and a man practicing it, and they will walk through fire for the second one. I ran a mentorship session myself around that time for a group of candidates that included Beck. I do not usually talk about 2011, but I told them a piece of it because they needed to hear it from someone who had stood where the standard gets paid in full. I told them about the night that earned me the medal, just the edges of it, and I told them the part nobody puts in a citation. The strongest thing I ever did, I said, was not the thing they gave me a medal for. It was staying calm when staying calm felt impossible. Anybody can be brave for 10 seconds with their blood up. The job is being steady when you are terrified and exhausted and certain it has all gone wrong. That's not something you're born with. That's something you build, one impossible day at a time. Nobody can give it to you and nobody can take it away. Not an instructor, not your family, not a man who knocks your coffee across a table. It's yours. I watched Owen Beck's face while I said it, and I saw something settle in him that I recognized because I had felt it settle in me once, in a mentorship session run by a Master Chief named Walt Sumner 22 years before. Doyle found me on the waterfront path that evening. He walked with me a while in silence, and then he admitted, in the gruff way of senior enlisted men confessing anything, that he had misjudged my plan. He had wanted me to swing the axe, and he had thought I was soft for not swinging it. He told me the command felt different now, lighter, that candidates were performing better, not worse, that the bar had not dropped an inch, and yet more of them were clearing it, because fear had been quietly replaced with something that actually makes people brave. I told him it was not me. It was the candidates and the instructors who chose to change, and a quiet man named Reuben who refused to nod when it would have been easier to nod. I deflected the credit because the credit was not mine to keep. A command is not a person, it is a culture, and cultures do not change because one captain is clever. They change because enough people decide, in enough small moments, to be honest when fear would have been easier. There was an evening, about 3 weeks into Maddox mentoring Beck, that told me it was real. I was walking back from the headquarters building after dark when I passed the training grounds and saw the two of them still out there. Long after the day was over, no audience, no one keeping score. Beck was struggling with a knot-tying task under load, his hands cold and clumsy with fatigue, and Maddox was crouched beside him, not barking, not looming, just talking him through it in a low voice and making him do it again and again and again, with a patience the old Maddox did not possess. Nobody was watching. That is the part that mattered. A man performs patience when he thinks his commander is looking. He practices it when he believes no one is. I stood in the dark for a minute and watched a chief who had once knocked my coffee across a table teach a kid he had nearly destroyed how to keep his hands steady when his body wanted to quit. And I understood that the command had healed in the only place healing ever actually happens, which is in the small, unwitnessed moments when people choose, with no reward in sight, to be better than they were. A once feared chief was kneeling in the sand that week beside a candidate he had almost destroyed, showing him how to do it right. And the captain who could have ended him stood at a distance and watched and said nothing at all. The change of command ceremony was set for the end of the month, and as it approached, I found myself thinking less about the command and more about a kitchen in inland California, and a father who had set down his fork 26 years ago and told me the Navy was no place for his daughter. But before I tell you about the invitation, I have to tell you about the night I have spent 20 years not telling people about, because you cannot understand the rest of it otherwise. The medal, 2011. We were attached to a special operations task unit for a night clearance operation, the kind of thing that exists in no headline and never will. It went wrong the way these things go wrong, all at once, and from a direction nobody planned for. The element was ambushed in a tight urban warren, pinned, and the only way out ran through a doorway that somebody had wired to collapse the whole structure on anyone who crossed it. That was my job. That was the entire reason a bomb technician was on a door-kicking mission in the first place. I worked that render safe on my knees in the dark with rounds coming through the walls, and Eli Sandoval crouched over me the whole time with his body between me and the worst of it, calling out the threats so I could keep my hands on the device, telling me, in that easy voice of his, that I had all the time in the world, even though we both knew I had almost none. I opened the door. The element got out. And then Eli went back because a wounded man was still inside, and Eli Sandoval was constitutionally incapable of leaving anyone behind. He did not come out. They gave me the Navy Cross for opening that door. They gave Eli a folded flag and a headstone, and they gave his mother a son who would never call again. They gave me a medal for the night I lost the best man I ever served with. I will tell anyone who asks. I have never once thought of it as a prize. It is the weight I carry so that his staying meant something. That is the citation the candidates were briefed on the morning Brett Maddox knocked my coffee across the table. That is the standard, not a heroic 10 seconds. A man who stayed, and a woman who has spent the rest of her life trying to be worth the staying. For years I told no one that story, not because it was classified, though parts of it were, but because grief does not translate into the language people want to use about medals. They want to call you a hero, and the word lands wrong, because the night was not heroic to me. It was the worst thing that ever happened, and I happened to do my job in the middle of it. I have sat through dinners where someone learned about the Navy Cross and got that shine in their eyes, and I have watched them deflate when I would not perform the part of the brave warrior for them. Eli understood. Eli would have understood. He used to say the only people who romanticize the job are the ones who have never had to carry someone out of it. I think part of why I fought so hard for this command, and why a man knocking my coffee across a table did not break me, is that I had already met the thing that breaks you, and it was not rudeness in a mess hall. It was a folded flag and a mother on a doorstep. After that, very little in this world has the power to make you flinch. A few days before the ceremony, I sat at my desk with a change of command invitation, and I addressed it to Glenn and Dean Harper in the town where I grew up. I hesitated for a long time with the pen over the envelope. I expected nothing. I had learned a long time ago to expect nothing from that house, because expecting nothing is the only armor that actually works. But I mailed it anyway. I think some door in me that I keep painted shut had cracked open just enough to hope, and I was too tired that week to paint it closed again. Then I called Walt Sumner, retired now, his voice a little slower than it used to be, but the steel still in it. I asked him to come. He did not hesitate for even a second. "Wouldn't miss it," he said. And then he said the thing I had needed to hear for 22 years without knowing I needed it. "I told you back at the start that it would try to break you. I never told you the rest because you had to find it out for yourself. It doesn't get to. Whatever tries, it doesn't get to." I sat with the phone in my hand after he hung up, and I did not trust my own voice for a while. In the days before the ceremony, I walked the command and watched it run the way I had dreamed it could. Candidates pushing each other instead of competing to survive a man's moods. Instructors hard and fair and unafraid to be both. Owen Beck, steady now, helping a struggling classmate the way someone had finally helped him. Brett Maddox in the background, coaching, quieter than he used to be. A man rebuilding himself, one honest correction at a time. I had taken command of a place ruled by fear, and in a single month it had become a place ruled by something better. And I stood there, in the middle of the only kind of family I'd ever managed to build. And I wondered whether the one room I still could not command was the one I had grown up in. Whether the hardest gate I had ever stood at was not any of the ones with razor wire and armed sentries, but the front door of a small house in a sun-bleached town where a father I had spent my whole life trying not to need had, for 26 years, never once turned around. The invitation sat unanswered on my desk. And I did not know, right up until the morning of the ceremony, whether anyone was coming. The morning of the change of command came up clear and bright, the kind of sky that does not ask permission. The parade deck was set with rows of white chairs and the colors snapping in the wind off the water, and the command I had walked into anonymously a month before now stood in formation. For me, on purpose. There is a particular feeling to that, to being saluted by a place you first entered in a gray shirt with coffee soaking into your sleeve. It is not pride, exactly. It is something quieter. It is the feeling of work, finally, being seen for what it was all along. I took the command formally, the old words said in the old order, the authority passing from one set of hands to mine in front of everyone who would have to trust it. Command Master Chief Doyle stood at my side, steady as a piling. Down the cadre line stood Brett Maddox, in his dress uniform, a man who a month ago had ruled this place through fear and now stood in it as someone learning a harder and better trade. And in the seats in his old retired blues that did not quite button the way they used to, sat Master Chief Walt Sumner, who had told a frightened 22-year-old that the work would try to break her, and had been right, and had also been right about the rest of it. It doesn't get to. He caught my eye during the ceremony and gave me the smallest nod, and I had to look at the horizon for a second to keep my composure. And then I saw them. In the back row, awkward in a sport coat I had never seen him wear, sat my father, Glenn Harper. And beside him, my brother Dean, turning his program over and over in his hands, the way our father turns a wrench when he does not know what to say. They had come. After 26 years of set down forks and changed subjects and silence on the phone, they had gotten in a car and driven to watch their daughter and sister take command of the hardest school in the fleet. I do not know what I felt in that moment. I have diffused bombs with a steadier pulse. I thought, absurdly, of the carburetor I rebuilt at 13, and the truck with the cracked sensor, and all the years of work my father had heard about secondhand and never come to see. And here he was, on a folding chair on a parade deck, having driven across the better part of a state to watch the work with his own eyes for the first time in his life. It was not the kind of reckoning the movies promise. There was no tearful collapse, no grand apology, with music swelling underneath. After the ceremony, in the milling crowd, Dean found me first. He looked at the formation, at the men and women who had just stood for me, and then he looked at his own shoes, and then at me. "I said you wouldn't last a month," he said, on the driveway that day. "I've thought about it more than you know." He swallowed. "I've never been so glad to be wrong about anything in my life, Addie." Then my father, Glenn Harper, who measured people by whether they showed up, standing in front of a daughter who had shown up for the country for 22 years while he looked the other way. His jaw worked. He is not a man who has words for these things. He never was. He reached out and, of all things, straightened the ribbon on my chest with two cracked, careful fingers, the way he used to torque a bolt to spec. Like precision was the only language of love he had ever learned. "Your mother would have," he started, and stopped, and started again. "She'd have been proud. She always said you'd be something we didn't have the imagination for." He met my eyes, finally, after a lifetime of looking at the engine, instead of the kid handing him the tools. "I should have said it a long time ago, Addie. I'm saying it now. I'm proud of you. I'm sorry it took me so long to turn around." I did not need him to say it. That is the thing I had finally learned, somewhere in the years between the kitchen and the parade deck. I had built my worth without his permission, and it was solid, and it would have stood whether or not he ever came. But I will not pretend it did not mean something to hear it. The wound did not vanish. It just, at long last, began to close. On my terms, in my time, in the place I had built with my own hands. Near the cadre line, Brett Maddox waited until the family had drifted off, and then he came to attention in front of me and rendered a salute. It was a correct salute, sharp and clean, the kind any chief gives any captain, but this one was not forced out of him by a master chief's bellow in a silent mess hall. This one he had earned the right to give, and we both knew the difference, and that difference was the whole story. "Ma'am," he said. That was all. He did not grovel. I would not have respected him if he had. He just held the salute until I returned it, and in the holding was everything neither of us needed to say. After it was over, after the chairs were folded and the crowd thinned and the colors came down, I walked back out to the waterfront path alone, to the same stretch of seawall where I had walked anonymous and unknown a month before. The light was going long and gold over the water again. I stood there a while, and I thought about Eli Sandoval, who would have made some terrible joke about the whole ceremony and then gotten quietly emotional at the end of it, the way he always did. And I thought about you, whoever you are, listening to this. Because I suspect you know exactly what it is to do the quiet, hard, unglamorous work and have the people who should see it look the other way. I never needed the room to stand for me. But I will tell you what I learned the morning a chief knocked my coffee across a table. The people who underestimate you are not a wall. They are just weather. You keep walking and you keep doing the work that is yours to do, and one day you look up and the storm is behind you and the sky is doing that thing it does over the water, and you realize you got here on your own 2 feet the entire time. If someone ever made you feel small for being steady, for being patient, for staying when everyone else had a reason to run, then hear me, because I mean this with everything I have. You do not owe them a reveal. You do not owe them a single dramatic moment of vindication. You just owe yourself the next step. Take it. The work is yours. So is the sky. If you have ever done the quiet, unglamorous work and watched the people who should have seen it look the other way, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Do you think I was right to give Chief Maddox a chance to change instead of ending his career that first morning? And if you had been sitting in that mess hall when the Command Master Chief called the room to attention, would you have frozen with the rest of them? Or would you have been the one who already knew better than to laugh? This story was never about putting one man in his place. It was about choosing dignity when revenge would have been easier. And if that meant something to you, hit subscribe and stay a while. I read every comment, and I answer the ones I can.